Great. Thanks, Leona. So perhaps before I just start talking on this subject, it's I think really nice initiative that you've launched here, Leona, and thanks so much for including us all in it. Um, for me, the whole basis of good practice in medicine is like a three-legged stool. It's based on good clinical practice and then education, not only of ourselves, but also of the doctors that will follow us in the future. And hopefully they will do better than we do. And then thirdly, involvement in ongoing development of our specialty with research. So those are, I think, three very important pillars to making sure that we have high quality practice. Another thing that I've noticed, if you like, moving from the UK down to Australia, is that when you look at the world from different geopolitical spots, you see that some areas are great at collaboration in research, and some perhaps it's a newer concept to have international collaboration. So, for example, I think there's obviously good collaboration going on in the United States and across Europe. The UK and the Commonwealth often have studies where there are good collaborators. Um, and recently, it's interesting in Asia, Leona, obviously, you've run a few studies with preeclampsia where you've managed to bring many nations together. And one of my aspirations for the Fetal Medicine Foundation in the Asia Pacific is to, I think, reinforce what you've already started in terms of developing international collaborations for research across our region. So the two topics that Leona asked me to talk to, one is hotspots in obstetric research, and the other is how you stay up to date with the literature. So I'll start with some hotspots. So in terms of identifying hotspots, I thought I'd look at this in the context of four different ways we can do this. So the first is to look at the literature, the bibliographic referencing that we have, and to see how growth in various areas is reflected in levels of publication. The second is to look where the funding is. And if you're going to do large studies these days, they often cost millions of dollars to do. So it is important that we can seek financial backing. And that goes in one of two ways. You can have a bright idea and apply for money for a novel, bright idea, but also you'll find there's often funding, either philanthropic or from government sources, that is looking for researchers to invest in very specific projects. Then the third aspect I wanted to talk about were some of the influencers, both in terms of leaders in our field and also looking at some of the other things that influence the development of our specialty. So pharma might be an example of that. And then finally, opportunities that you might have getting in early on the ground floor with startups. So this is one way of trying to identify whether a topic that you perceive you have an interest in is, if you like, a hot topic at the moment. So I've been interested in cell-free DNA and prenatal diagnosis for quite a long time, really probably since I did my own research with Kipros back in the late 1990s. This is a PubMed search. PubMed is quite good as a clinical database, and actually quite nicely when you look at PubMed on the left-hand side of the page, it identifies the number of publications for each year for the research topic that you've chosen. So this is a very easy way to get a feel for whether a topic that you are interested in is expanding or retracting in the context of international interest. You can make this more complicated using a variety of different tools. So, for example, the Scopus indexing system or the Web of Science indexing system, you can search those databases and you can then download your findings from those databases and put them into other software. So the one I've used as an example here is something called SiteSpace. And then you can get that software to sort all of the references that you've identified. And when you do that, it will then tell you, um, if you like, what the directions are in terms of growth. So it will tell you how many publications you have per year. It will tell you about how there's thematic evolution within the topic. Will tell you whether there are very specific areas that are becoming hot, and also perhaps tell you about clusters of groups who are working together within this space. And you can then obviously interpret that, let's say, according to a timeline. So you can see, for example, with cell-free DNA here, how first we looked at its biology, and then we looked at its applications for aneuploidy, and then we looked at its applications for things like fetal fraction and microdeletions. Now, sometimes it's good to step back from your own specialty and look what's going on around you. So, for example, I work in a multi-story building, and the floor below me belongs to a group of gastroenterologists who are interested in circulating tumor cells and developing liquid biopsies and therapies for a variety of GI problems, including cancers. And because it has the word cancer in it, they have lots of money and they have lots of equipment. And they're using techniques and technologies that are actually very similar to those that I'm interested in terms of single cell work within prenatal diagnosis. So this is just an example of trying to map some of the things that they've been doing in terms of looking at gastric cancer and then liquid biopsy and circulating tumor cells. And you can see here it's color coded for time. So you can see how we start with, if you like, fairly basic interventions, surgery, looking at the tissue that's come from surgery, and gradually how that has then worked its way out into various genomic techniques and technologies, and also using different potential biomarkers, looking at microRNAs, looking at things like exosomes and exosome messaging, extracellular vesicles. And so sometimes if you move laterally and see what's going on around you, first it allows you to recognize pathways where perhaps you could apply something similar within your own field. And, if these are materials and equipment that are readily available to you, then it's often relatively easy to piggyback onto these successful groups when you're starting up your own research group. So let's talk a little bit about finding funding. So funding comes from various sources. I've started at the top here. International philanthropic funding. Obviously, Gates Foundation is best known for this. They launch a series of grant opportunities, a round of grant funding they call global grand challenges, where they identify a problem that they feel needs solving, and they're looking for researchers to potentially provide researchers solutions. So you can look at the websites from a variety of different philanthropic groups. You need to develop your own list so that you can go back to them on a regular basis and look at different schemes as they're launched. So that's an example of a philanthropic version. This is a version more local to me. So I work for New South Wales Health, and recently we had a grant round funding launched for prevention research to support academic units. And they were, again, very specific about what they wanted. So there were three streams that they named. And this stream was potentially focused around maternity in the first 2,000 days, including preventative care, looking at substance use, and also looking at low birth weight. So suddenly you have potentially some grant funding that's very much aligned with your own interests. So the influencers. Um, Depends how old you are as to what you call an influencer. If you're like me, then it's something that you might want to read in a magazine or read on the internet, or lo and behold, even go to the World Congress of Fetal Medicine and hear who's talking and listen to the summaries of those sessions to identify, if you like, what the leading specialists in our field are thinking and where they feel our services are going to develop over the next decade. If you're younger, then you might find your influencers on social media. And certainly there are now a number of maternal fetal medicine specialists who are quite prolific in that space. And again, um, they, I think, are beginning to identify areas for ongoing development. Now, I wanted to talk about startups. So, this is a local example to me of a biotech company called Baymatob that has developed a device to look at uterine contraction. Actually, the chief executive was a PhD student that worked with me several years ago and now has this very successful business. Um, if you're starting in research, often it's nice to find local individuals who you can work with and collaborate with. And so one of the ways to do that is to look at what's going on in the local biotech market around you. You might then find companies like this one that are enrolling patients in studies for their new equipment. It allows you potentially to get in on the ground floor with these individuals. They're often very technology focused, so they're often looking for collaborations with clinicians. And I think that this is a very good way to get started with work that's often very innovative. Again, you can take that to much bigger examples. So this is, a big pharma company, Johnson and Johnson, developing treatment for um, um, preventing or arresting the development of rhesus-issue immunization and hemolytic disease of the newborn. They published in the New England Journal of Medicine about a year ago a phase 2 study. And so immediately, if you see something like that published, you know that that may well then lead to a phase 3 study. So you can go and search that out. And this is, if this is what floats your boat, if this is where you want to be researching, then, can you be a center that is part of this study? And another example of that within the preeclampsia world is at the moment there's a firm developing an RNA-based therapy for preventing the deterioration of women that have preeclampsia. And again, if you look at the biotech industry news, you can see that these are people who have a significant war chest now for going on to demonstrate that these technologies work. And again, if you're interested in being part of these types of trials, then looking at the biotech press is often a good way to identify these studies. So I might move on to talking a bit about how you can stay updated in maternal fetal medicine. Um, I've used this as an example because I think this is happening worldwide at the moment. The national housing emergency in Australia, where everyone feels they're sinking because they really can't do enough to get on and survive. And I think often the analogy here is like the amount of publications and information that we see within our specialty, and how do you stay up to date with it and keep it all keep a lid on it. So one way to do it is to identify a top 10 watch list. There's not quite 10 here, but this is my watch list, things I'm interested in. And these would be things that ideally, I want to set up a process whereby new publications that are involved in these different areas are identified and sent to me. So these days, you can do that very easily. Again, if you go to PubMed, you can create alerts in PubMed for different topics, and then the alert will be sent to you on a regular basis. And down the bottom here, you can see I've used Copilot to help me design the term that I'm going to put in to PubMed to make sure that I get the appropriate papers. And I can do this for all of the different areas of maternal fetal medicine that I'm interested in. The next stage then actually is to get Copilot to collate the 10 different searches that you've set up and to then report them each to you on an individual basis, on a regular basis, and finally to help you work out which of the papers that you need to pay more attention to. Other things that you need to do to stay current is you need to identify from, if you like, key journals, what's being published. So you can actually subscribe to each journal to get what's called a table of contents alert. And they will then basically send you the index to the journal each month as it's published. That's an easy way to identify new material. You can do that for guidelines as well. This is an example of the Australian guidelines for obstetrics. You can filter them here. I filtered them by obstetrics, and then I want the recent ones, so I put 2025. And this is just an example of the most recent publications that we have, so that you can make sure that you are up to date with those. And again, obviously, you can do that across a group of different national guidelines. You've got to then make time to actually look at this material. And I think it's important to diarize that. So make sure you have a recurring calendar slot. And you probably do that in two different ways. One that allows you to triage the information. So that's a weekly fast scan just to stay on top of things. And then the second is perhaps a monthly longer session where you just shut the door on the world and spend a couple of hours perhaps focusing on a single topic that seems to have shifted significantly in the last few months, and you do a deeper dive into it. So how do you actually use that information? Well, I think the first is it's good to just keep a log of what you've achieved in terms of doing that. And often, certainly for our college, it's useful to be able to report that for CPD. There are, again, software tools that help you store individual references, things like EndNote. And then, again, you can use AI-based technologies to help you produce short summaries of either individual papers or groups of papers. I think it's important we talk about these as groups. Again, I think collaboration is key in our specialty, communication is key. So making sure you have some event in your department's calendar to allow you to share and translate these findings into clinical practice is important. And then every now and again, perhaps on an annual basis, just review your list of 10 priority areas, decide perhaps which ones are a bit slow at the moment and can perhaps come off the list. And you might have some new areas that you think should go on the list as you move forwards. And I think that's all I've got to say. So thanks very much, Leona. I might hand back to you.
Thank you, Jon. Actually, I have to say I don't do any of those things. And so I'm actually every day is a learning day for me. And I receive information from everybody. And somehow, yes, I've become some sort of a rubbish bin. And it's not easy to filter the garbage out. And so great tips about, being more systematic in searches and all that. So fantastic overview and an And I would like to encourage our participants to ask questions. It's a very good opportunity to ask any questions, simple or you think is a stupid question. Don't worry about it, because we all start somewhere with research, and it's a really good opportunity to direct your questions to all these experts in the area. So don't worry about how we think about your question. So that's a good start. And let me then I'll continue, and then we'll do Q&A at the end, if that's okay with all of you. And so I just also want to share my 2 cents in relation to how we can stay up to date, and perhaps some of my slides can just, it's interesting, absolutely no overlap, and we have different views and we do things differently. And I think, I think strong research topic is something that we always talk about, and I always think about every day I have a research question, because I think about why am I doing this. I think this is something that is important for us to kind of focus on, and make sure that what you want to do in terms of developing a research topic, then you need to identify the clinical gaps. You need to know whether your topic, your project is feasible, and whether the topic aligns with the interests of others, and of course, and you need to make sure it is a novel idea. And so these are just some of my thoughts and emerging scientific priorities. And I think Jon has already covered them already, but I think do watch these space. Genetics is definitely having a major role in what we do in maternal fetal medicine and early prediction of pregnancy risks. AI watches topic, big interest in maternal cardiometabolic health in relation to long-term impact. So I think Jon has covered some of them already, regular journal review, but he really gave you all the tips, the hands-on tips as to how you could be kept up to date. And I think in relation to collaborative partnerships, that's more challenging, Jon. Perhaps we can talk a bit more about that during our discussion, because often we are shy, especially us in Asia. Language barrier, cultural barrier, unless you're asked, we don't speak up and all that. So it's not easy for our junior colleagues to really seek collaboration. It's easy for us to talk about collaboration between us, but then it would take them a lot of courage to even seek a mentor, as well as considering partnerships with major research group and even a pharma. And of course, lifelong learning as a researcher. So don't want to dwell on this, but then I think you've already highlighted in the current era the use of digital tools. AI is extremely important. But when our advice, I'm sure we'll cover that later on in the program, is that you need to fact check, because not what AI tells you is the truth. Sometimes it hallucinates and gives you what they think is the truth, but instead is not the truth. And so I think it's important for our colleagues here that they are aware of the limitations of AI. And I mentioned about mentorship as well. And I practice reverse mentoring a lot, because I can be wrong, and therefore I would invite my students to challenge me, and it's always very inspiring when they come up with something new and that they are even more up to date than me. Then this is important for us to accept the fact that yes, we need to be mentored, but at the same time, as a mentor, I could appreciate reverse mentoring and research methodology, advanced research methodologies. And as we go along with this program, we'll cover some of these aspects. So now moving on to my boring topic, but I think it's important. As I mentioned, every day I wake up, I think about what I do on a daily basis. Why am I doing this? Why am I measuring blood pressure in the antenatal clinic? Why am I doing the urine dipstick? Have you ever thought about these questions? or are you simply blindly following the protocols, the guidelines? This is obviously not easy, because challenging guidelines is never easy. I just came back from mainland China. They recently updated the consensus about aspirin usage and all that. But we are still doing our randomized trial comparing the different dosages of aspirin. And so the question to me was, how do we overcome challenges with existing guidelines? And if you want to do something new, am I going to be putting patients at risk? Am I being unethical because we are deviating from guidelines? So guidelines, I would say, are there as a guide. And so you have to come up with justifications as to why you are deviating from the guidelines. And then with this thought process, you have to be very analytical, very logical. And I think so with your daily clinical practice, if you're questioning why you're doing something, then that could be your first research question. So don't hesitate and think like that. See, a bit slow with my PowerPoint. I apologize. These are the key steps, and I often talk about these 10 steps, and I want every one of my team members to be very well equipped. Of course, topic selection is the first step, and I mentioned perhaps something interests you on the ward or in the clinic, a topic that you come across in a conference, and then if your question is valid, then you need to know whether someone has already answered your question, and therefore you need to know what is known, and then a literature search will be necessary with that. And then you need to then move on and think about the clinical research problem, and I'll propose some suggestions with examples, so not to make it so dry and boring. And then you have a clinical problem, then you formulate a research question that leads to developing the study aims, and then you need to then make it into a real plan to execute a research project. I think that we will cover later on in the program, because we will want to talk about how to implement clinical research studies. And I'm told very often that it's impossible for them to roll out a research study because of their heavy clinical duties. Once you've set up the project, study is running, you should know how to collect the data, how to analyze the data, and then you need to verify the hypotheses based on the findings. And of course, actually 99% of the time, I feel that we're suffering quite a bit until the last 1% when I see the results and I can present the findings in a paper. That's really quite depressing, but rewarding at the same time. Choosing a topic, as I've referred to, whether you come across something that you want to touch on. Also, controversies are always very hot. And to convert your initial question into a research question, then you need to narrow it down. And there are two ways of narrowing down to a research question. The first is the PICO framework that I will refer to, and then you need to check whether your question is good. Then you use the final criteria, and I go through these examples. Daniel, I'm borrowing your trial, and then we will kind of go through the aspirin trial. It's a very simple example, because randomized trials are the best methodology, and it's much easier for using this as demonstrating how to formulate a research question. The PICOT framework. P stands for population, so who you want to do the research on. I is intervention, C is comparator, O is outcome, and T is time frame. And most of you are familiar with PICO without the T, but actually time frame is very important. I'll explain that later on. And target population, you need to know who you are doing the research on based on the fact that what is your research question. You need to define the population. You need to keep it narrow or broad. Are you doing research on a vulnerable group? Actually, we are, because we are doing research involving pregnant women. So by default, we are doing research in a vulnerable group. And so therefore, ethical approval is always challenging, and you need to define the eligibility criteria. And then you need to develop the recruitment strategy, because I think it's very well that we have a fantastic research question. What if you can't even recruit to target? And just to go through the population of the ASPRO trial, very simple. We were identifying high-risk women through the first trimester combined test, and our interest was not just a single-center study. We wanted to make sure that our results can be generalizable, and therefore we included 6 countries and 13 hospitals. And in terms of eligibility criteria, then you would have inclusion criteria. It's very simple here. A viable pregnancy at 11, 13 weeks, having undergone the first trimester combined test screening. Then exclusion criteria we listed out, such as regular treatment with aspirin within 28 days before recruitment, bleeding disorders, etc., etc. It seems simple, but when you start planning, then you have to be very specific. Intervention, very clear here, is aspirin. But then when you're planning your study, and it may not be a drug trial, it could be simply an observational study. That could be a scan observation. That is an intervention. That is also possible. You need to know, you need to justify the appropriateness and the standardization of intervention. If it's a drug or it's a surgical procedure, then you need to be aware of the potential side effects and how would the side effects be recorded, etc. Then C is comparator, and in the ASPRO trial, then we had a placebo group, and that is the best way of doing a randomized trial, a double-blinded placebo-controlled drug randomized trial. Then that will allow us to evaluate if the comparator, the intervention would be effective in preventing a pregnancy outcome or treating a pregnancy outcome. And so that's simple. And then outcome, I want to mention a little bit more about the outcome, because many of us are very greedy, because we tend to have many outcomes included in the design of the project. But then I want to emphasize the importance of the primary outcome, and that has to be simple and with a clear objective. Based on the primary outcome, then you do the sample size estimation, because if you have many things within the primary outcome, then it could be very confusing, and that may lead to insufficient power to refute the null hypothesis. And then another consideration would be secondary outcomes. So while, okay, we cannot be greedy with the primary outcome, then can we be greedy with the secondary outcomes? Actually, we tend to be greedy, but then we shouldn't be, because actually we want to see if, at least in this trial, aspirin, was it possible for us to also prevent a number of placenta-related complications, such as SGA, stillbirth, abruption. But challenge would be that it means that it's unlikely that we would achieve statistical power for all secondary outcomes. So in the ideal setting, I would do the power calculation for every single secondary outcome and choose the highest number of the sample size in order to cover all the outcome measures I would like to evaluate. Then time frame. This is important, actually, especially for the ASPRO trial, because we experienced some challenges during the trial, whereby we had to put the trial on hold, and then we added a screening component to buy some time, and then so we started the trial in 2014. And so timing is so critical when everything is ready and something goes wrong. And with randomized trials, things do go wrong, and you have to be prepared with contingent measures, and therefore being very time aware, time sensitive, knowing how you would follow up these patients and making sure that if you don't meet the recruitment target, if you extend the trial, are you going to reduce the power of the studies? These are all the things that we have to think about. That's why I think this PCOT framework is very helpful for us to really plan the project based on the research question. So moving on from the ASPRE trial, which is a typical conventional drug, placebo-controlled drug trial. And recently we published on this implementation trial. And the reason why we decided to do an implementation trial in Asia and not replicating the ASPRE trial in Asia was that, well, purely we managed to prove that aspirin at 150 milligrams can prevent preterm preeclampsia. And I think it would be absolutely impossible for us to do a placebo-controlled trial in Asia just to replicate that work. So that's why we did not consider this, and we just decided to do an implementation trial. Because of the design whereby we did not have a comparator group, and so we did a step wedge, and I'll explain that in a minute. And we did the comparator phase first. That's the non-intervention phase, whereby we did not roll out any research procedures, followed by the intervention phase in a step wedge design. And the intervention phase was screening based on the combined test, followed by aspirin prophylaxis in high-risk women. And the outcome measures we had were exactly like the ASPRE trial, because my thinking back then was that I would love to meta-analyze these two trials at the end, and then if we don't share the same outcome measures, then that wouldn't be possible. So that was also with the ASPRE trial, it was a very good structure for us to decide on our outcome measures. In terms of the time frame, we were hit by COVID during the forecast study, and we had to halve our recruitment rate because some centers were not allowed to do any research during the pandemic, and in the end we extended the trial by 60 weeks. And by the end, well, because you design a trial, you apply for ethics, and the ethics committee will ask you, when is the end date of this project? And you need to give that date, and that has to be followed. And so when the end date came, we basically recruited 42,000 cases instead of 68,000 cases. And the conclusion was that we could not extend the trial for any longer because we were not able to improve the statistical power by extending the trial, and therefore we concluded as we designed the trial. And so we did not reach our recruitment target. So it's a very important lesson for us when we plan a research program, a research trial, that you need to consider time frame as one of the factors. And in terms of the step wedge design, just a quick slide on the advantages. And here you can see the schematic description of the step wedge trial. Essentially, all clusters started with no research interventions, and we were able to stagger the start of the trial for those 7 clusters. It's actually extremely difficult to start such a massive trial across all clusters at the same time. So the cluster design allowed us to stagger the start date of the various clusters, and then when we were ready, every 6 weekly, each cluster, which was randomly assigned by the randomization program, and then they would roll over into the intervention phase. And during the intervention phase, they were allowed to screen and release the report, and then high-risk women were treated with aspirin. And then the advantages are explained. I think it's just a very, cumbersome way, but then I think it's a good connection between a fantastic randomized trial and implementation. I feel like there's a disconnect between doing a randomized trial and then making a difference in a clinical sense. And so having this option to do an implementation study allowed us to ease the screening program for preeclampsia into our daily clinical practice. And by now, at least in my center, this is part of routine care. Now, moving on to whether we have a good research question final, feasibility, interest, novelty, ethics, and relevance. So these are for your reference, and I will not dwell on every single slide, but then you can understand. If you want to have a question answered, you need to do a research study that is feasible. If it's absolutely not feasible because the incidence of this condition is 1 in 10,000, then you need to be very careful in terms of how you design that study, and it's likely to be a case control study. And then again, later on in the program, we will talk about study designs and how you can choose a study design to answer a certain question. And then the interest, of course, has to be interesting. Otherwise, luckily, I've been doing something that is very interesting for preeclampsia research, using ultrasound to predict for outcomes, etc. So being aware of what is interesting is important. Novelty, again, when we review a paper, the first question we ask, is this topic novel? But we are not all Einstein. I completely understand that we don't just wake up one day and think about this amazing idea out of nowhere. So some considerations is that you need to look at what is available, what has been done, but you can give your own twist to it. That might become novel with that one twist. Indeed, we can't just come up with new things all the time. Then is the question, the project ethical, and is it relevant? So these are all very important aspects to consider. Just some examples that I'll quickly run through, and I'm mindful of time, but we'll have a discussion after this talk. Using the FINER criteria, I've come up with 2 questions, and because this is not interactive, because I've done this as a face-to-face, and then I would invite comments, but then how does social media affect people's behavior? I think if you're simply asking this on social media, that's fine, but this is so broad. And if you're thinking about doing a study to answer this question, then it would be hard for you to design a study to answer this question. Is social media affecting people's behavior? Then what we can do is to narrow down how often you use social media, and what is the social media of interest? Is it TikTok? And is it affecting the attention span of young people? So then you can then make it into a more specific research question. Example 2, has there been an increase in childhood obesity in China in the past 10 years? And again, this is perhaps too specific now, right? The answer is yes. And therefore, you probably don't want to do a research on this. And so you can think of how you can narrow it down to creating a research question. Maybe you would want to think about school intervention programs, parental education levels. Are they affecting the rate of childhood obesity amongst the 1st to the 6th grade students? So that becomes more specific for you to then conduct a study. And something super, super important, but you just wonder why we have to have a hypothesis, because I kind of mentioned the importance of, you need to do a study to refute the null hypothesis or something like that. Statistically, we'll touch on this, but then if you're writing a master dissertation or you're writing a PhD, then often you need to write out your objectives, and then you need to also write out your hypotheses. A hypothesis is essential because it gives a study a clear, testable focus that guides the choice of methods and analyses and keeps the research purposeful and scientifically rigorous. So it's important for you to not focus on hypothesis, but then I would also give you examples, so that is not so difficult. We start with a research question. We've already gone through the TikTok question, and then the obesity question, and then hypothesis for the first question can look like daily use of TikTok will reduce the attention span of children aged under 16. So with a hypothesis is more definite. This is based on your literature review, research, your literature search, and your observation that TikTok is going to affect the attention span of young people. And then you need to do a research project to prove that. And then for the next question in relation to obesity, your hypothesis will be both school intervention programs and high parental education levels will reduce the rate of childhood obesity amongst the first to the sixth grade students. So good hypotheses are, well, they have to be empirically testable and backed by preliminary evidence. So I was referring to the need of doing your initial literature review and search. Has to be testable by ethical research based on original ideas and founded on evidence-based logical reasoning and can be predicted. So this, just to go through 3 more examples, and then we can go on to a discussion. Give you some background, and you can now think about how you can generate this hypothesis. And the background here is that preterm preeclampsia is an important cause of maternal and perinatal death and complications. It is uncertain whether the intake of low-dose aspirin during pregnancy reduces the risk of preterm preeclampsia. The hypothesis is very simple here. The aspirin trial was designed to test the hypothesis that among women identified as high risk for preterm preeclampsia based on the first trimester combined test, taking 150 milligrams of aspirin daily from 11 to 14 weeks until 36 weeks would reduce the incidence of preterm preeclampsia by 50% compared to placebo. That was our hypothesis, and we based this hypothesis to calculate the power calculation, to do the power calculation. Then this is example 2. We conducted 2-arm randomized control trial to evaluate and compare changes in salivary cortisol and oxytocin levels of first-time pregnant women between experimental and control groups. Participants in the experimental group touched and held an infant for 30 minutes, whereas those in the control group watched a DVD of an infant. The primary outcome was salivary cortisol level, and the secondary outcome was salivary oxytocin level. So the hypothesis was written as below. We hypothesized that at 30 minutes after touching and holding an infant, the salivary cortisol level would be significantly decreased and the salivary oxytocin level would increase in the experimental group compared with the control group. So you can basically change the background content into a hypothesis to be tested in this way. Final example, AI is increasingly used in obstetric ultrasound to support image acquisition, biometric measurements, and quality assurance, while AI has the potential to enhance consistency and reduce operator variability. Its real impact on scan duration and workflow efficiency remains unclear. So this is simple. AI-assisted obstetric ultrasound will reduce scan time and improve workflow efficiency compared with standard practice. So to summarize what I've gone through just now, you have to be very clear with what you want to do. So the background of the study has to be very clear. You need to clearly identify the research problem, which is based on the clinical problem. And you need to do your literature search to know what has been done already. Just because you don't know the answer doesn't mean that the research hasn't been done, and you don't want to waste your efforts and time in replicating something that has already been evaluated recently. Well, recently meaning that because it's important to be up to date, and if the work has been done ages ago, then yes, there may be room for you to revisit this topic. You need to construct the research questions and then develop the hypotheses and then specify the study aims. So thank you very much for your attention. Oh, there are some questions. Yes. Long, do you want to take us through the questions? And obviously, all panelists are welcome to contribute. And if you have any burning comments, because we've started something.
Yeah, the first question is, what is the panel's view in AI in medical research writing? it will certainly dilute the values of systematic reviews and meta-analysis as compared to original research. So the concern about the AI.
Shall I start with that? I'll give you a couple of different perspectives. So one of my roles is I look after medical students doing obstetrics and gynecology, and they have to write long cases as part of their assessment. And over the last 2 years, I think we've identified we now get up to about 70% of the content is potentially AI driven or written. And I think Leona already identified first that one of the potential problems with some platforms is that they're not necessarily particularly accurate in things like citation of literature. So they might make papers up completely, or alternatively, I've certainly had people quote papers that I've written that actually were just 3 or 4 different things that I'd written that were tacked together in a sentence by AI. So I think if you're going to use AI, I would use it as a tool. And it's important that you check the output and that you're quite fastidious about that. Another comment that I would make is that I think it does help organize your thoughts. And I think we should see it as a tool that helps us in efficiency of work. And for people like me, at the latter part of their career, as this is coming through, it's important that you take time out and learn how to use these technologies properly so that you can make the most of them, because they are revolutionizing our practice. Perhaps the final comment to make is in fetal medicine, we see patients that have often quite rare problems. They are using AI tools to generate advice about what the prognosis is for a child with a particular condition. So again, I think because we're interacting with people who are going to be using these technologies, it's important we have a good understanding. But overall, I have quite a positive feel about this technology. I think it's going to help us be more efficient in our work.
Daniel, thank you. Do you want
Thanks,
to
Leona.
contribute to this? Thank you.
Yes, and congratulations to you and Jon for these talks, and thanks, Prof, also for bringing us together, and Leona. I agree with Jon. I think AI can be used in many good ways and in many bad ways. I would say we should never let the AI do our jobs and let it do the work for us, but I think it can be used in very constructive and productive manner. So the way a lot of people are now using AI to help coding, for example, if you're doing statistical analysis, if you're writing a paper, I don't see a problem putting what you've written in the AI to ask for feedback or to ask for help in a couple of aspects of your text. I just don't like the idea of letting the AI do the job for you, and it often gets it wrong. So if you don't check what it's doing, it's not going to do a very good job sometimes. I'm not sure I understand the impact that would have on meta-analysis and systematic reviews. I think meta-analysis is very often problematic. People do it too much, probably because it's easy to do. It's a lot easier to do a meta-analysis than to actually collect patient data for original studies. And so I think meta-analysis in general, they can bring very good information, but very often they are misleading and poorly utilized. I don't see how AI would change that very much, to be honest. Let's see.
Actually, I think perhaps AI ultimately will make the search much easier, but then still we need to fact check. As I mentioned, AI can hallucinate. It's not just about whether it's inaccurate, it's just completely made up. And therefore, I mean, as a researcher, it is our our responsibility to fact check, and obviously maybe in the future there will be a specific AI program that helps us with the systematic review and meta-analysis. I'm sure that will come along, because right now we're using syntax and all that.
Very often, if you ask ChatGPT to give you 3 or 5 references on a specific topic, it will completely invent the references. Those studies have never actually happened.
I recently reviewed a document, and completely made up references, and so AI written and so obvious. And I think over time you would know whether this is written by AI, whether this is done by AI. The pattern is quite clear. Anyone else want to contribute to this? If not, then we will move on. Rizzo close. Thank you for joining.
Hello, everybody. Actually, I am using AI sometimes, as a secretary, and for us Asian people, I use AI as a secretary and not as a co-author, and the grammar and the language polishing and restructuring and organizing, in English, and that is a very, very useful. And recently, AI is much more advanced every day, the day by day. And some months ago, the AI sent a very wrong literature. For example, I asked any other the references, and then they make it. For example, the author is Liona Poon and the Kypros Nicolaides and the aspirin something, the for preeclampsia or something. But there's no such kind of the literature. But recently, that they are the advanced day by day. And also, as somebody said that the patient used AI for their decision making. So maybe, that we should know about the AI, and we utilize the AI. We don't be utilized by AI. So that is my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Long is muted, so I'm going to quickly, because there are quite a few questions. So I want to direct the next question to Clarissa. Knowing your background, what would be your best advice on how to find support when you want to start changing from being a clinician to a researcher? Would you be able to share with us? It's not an easy place you're in, and I know how hard you've worked to get to where you are.
Hi, good evening, everyone from the Philippines. Thank you for starting this FMF Asia Pacific webinar. It will be really helpful for all of us here. I think, in my country, a lot of people, if you're not with an academic institution, you get stuck doing clinical work. And first, if you want to do research, I think you really have to be connected with an academic institution or a hospital with a training program. And we have certain systems or protocols that we follow in my country as well. So you have to get certified with the ethics board. You have to have research integrity certificates and all of these GCP certificates in order to be allowed to do research. So I think basically learning the ropes of research in your own country would be good. Coming from a low resource setting country, maybe funding would be harder to get if you're not in an institution that actually has a lot of initiative to give funds for researchers. But I find that collaborating not only within my specialty, but outside of my specialty and outside of the country helps to start research projects that can, be brought over. And we also have to include other like researchers, like students, like your fellows and your residents. So the more people you have in your projects, I think the more it will actually grow and you can churn more research output from there.
All right. So the next question is about the funding. So when we get the funding from the special company, do we think that it would interfere our result or our research?
So shall I start with that one?
Yeah.
I think Clarissa's already pointed out that, often resources are difficult and you do need to try and identify funding to support your research. Traditional routes of funding perhaps have been through public institutions, perhaps government funding. But just as an example, in Australia, those resources are limited, and so you might only have a successful grant on every 5 applications that you make. Another route to funding is a more commercial-based route. And now, if there is IP for something, and then people want to demonstrate the clinical value, which therefore means the commercial value of the IP, often there is a venture capital process associated with that, so that can fund research. So if you have a good idea, the first thing is potentially to make sure that you protect your intellectual property, so that you can then continue to develop that, and potentially get venture capital funding as an alternative pathway to the traditional routes that we have used as academics. And we could perhaps at some point debate the morals about intellectual property in the healthcare industry and whether we think that's a good or a bad thing. But it is part of the process at the moment of bringing innovation to market. And at the end of the day, that's useful for our patients. If you then take the individual relationship that you have with a company, if you're involved directly in research with a company, I think it's important you have a clear memorandum of understanding about what your relationship is. And part of that should be the process of how results are going to be assessed, and how data is going to be analyzed and disseminated. And some trials might be led by the commercial organization. Often they want to do that in a way that does not appear to produce bias, so they might involve a independent company to run that trial for them. Obviously, they might also be giving you resources to help you do independent research. And I think it's really important that you make sure at the outset that there is a clear pathway for you to be able to disseminate that information, even if it's a negative finding.
Obviously, it's important for us to distinguish between sponsor-led studies and PI or investigator-led studies. So often we go to commercial companies with a research idea, and if we came up with the idea and propose it to the company, then it becomes a investigator-led project, and often then you have a very clear agreement between us and the company, and very clear rules being laid down, and often then you don't need to worry about whether the company would influence your research design, the program, the data, etc. But if it's a sponsor-led project, meaning that the company has initiated the project, that's a different discussion. Often that comes with financial support, etc. And then the aim would be that they would get the data from you and they would also design the study for you.
So,
yeah, Yanis? Yanis, you want to comment?
Yes, thank you for the fantastic overview and this great initiative. Something that we should be aware of is the publication bias, which is because usually, very often, sponsors may want to suppress negative results, and also journals are a bit reluctant to publish negative trials. I mean, trials that there's no effect from the drug or the intervention. So I would like to table in this for discussion because this is something very often when we search, and regarding the how you become a researcher from a clinician, being a clinician, I think those two things are a bit quite related with each other because when you want to formulate the research question, you need to have a deep understanding of the root of the problem. And to connect this with the AI discussion, I think that sooner or later the problem-solving task will be taken over from AI. So we will be asked to, our main task will be to ask the appropriate question, and then the AI will give us the appropriate answer. But so far, writing and conducting research with AI, we should be very cautious because, as we said, it's a bit disturbing sometimes.
Daniel, you have your hand.
I think Oscar had a hand raised before me, Liona, if you want to.
Oscar, would you want to write your question? You want to directly, because there are other questions to be answered, but then I don't know whether this is a hand up so you can speak to us. No. Okay. But Oscar, if you have a question, go to Q&A. Thank you. We'll definitely take your question. Thank you.
Yeah, so just to complement what Liona said, I think there are two separate problems. One is selective reporting. So that's when people will only report what is statistically significant and what is a positive finding and not report things that are not significant. I mean, that problem is largely solved by publishing your protocol and defining what your outcomes and what your analysis would be before you do the study, right? So if you are doing a randomized trial, you define all those things before you publish the protocol, and that problem is largely solved. The other problem is publication bias, where journals are more likely to accept studies that have positive findings compared to studies that are negative. And that is a problem that I don't have a good solution to. Because from my point of view, it's just as important to know that something doesn't work as it is to know that it does work. So just to complement what Ioannis very rightly said.
So let's move on.
So
I think we've long.
Yeah. So I have a question for Valeria. So how to identify good quality research articles in the literature? I think this is a very common question for everyone.
Yeah. So I think the easiest way to start is checking the journal, that the journal is a peer review, that it is published, it's indexed in PubMed or in Web of Science. Then probably you should assess the research question. As we have been saying, it has to be a very clear objective. It needs to be like very well described. And then you should check that the usual study design, like what's the what's the variables. The variables are well related to the objective. If you have enough knowledge, it would be very good to check the statistics if they are well performed. And if not, maybe someone could help you with that. Thank you.
So I think there are actually a lot of questions in relation to AI. I think we already had a good discussion around that. So I wonder whether there are any burning comments from the panel based on today's topics or beyond. I wonder, Professor Nicolaides, do you have any comments for us? Because it's our first time doing something like this, and it's nerve-wracking for me. And it's just like, we all learned research, and we never attended a course.
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you, Liona, for setting up the FMF Asia Pacific, and to congratulate both you and Jon for the excellent lecture today. I think it's a great initiative. General comment, I think it is good to have presentations that are about 15 to 20 minutes. Otherwise, you lose the attention of people. And then have more time for discussion. I think the panel is very good. But I think that if it lasts for more than an hour and 15 minutes, you will begin to lose the audience. But we had a very good number of participants. And one of the questions that I saw was whether people will have access to this lecture. And in the website of the Fetal Medicine Foundation, we will have a special page for this series of lectures. The rest, they're very interesting comments from intelligent people, and I agree with most of them. In relation to AI, I think it's an irreversible process where there is a continuous dramatic improvement every few days. And I think whether we like it or not, it will be able to improve our practice. And we better learn, as somebody has mentioned, to use the tools provided by AI. We cannot continue to say, it's not good. We are very safe forever. We are not safe at all. AI will be superior by far from most of us. Two examples. One, patients that are writing letters of complaints now. Extraordinary, perfect organization. And it takes us hours to respond to these letters of complaints. And then yesterday, we had a review article from a very important journal. And 3 of the 4 reviewers used ChatGPT to write their reviews. They were very, very similar. And it was very obvious that they were writing from there. Jon has mentioned the issue of the patients themselves asking questions that are very well structured, and they know a lot more than us. So we need to be able to respond to those. But that's all really. AI is here to stay, and is going to increasingly improve our practice. Yeah.
I have my AI avatar already. So yes, next time I will not be here in person. My AI avatar will give all my lectures. But then, yeah, absolutely. I think is here, and we need to embrace it and make sure that it can integrate its use in our clinical data practice as well as in our research.